Welcome to SOAPBOX. I am your host Bruce, and this is still season 4. We are in episode 6. Now, for those of you who are viewing, you may notice that I have a guest with me. For those of you listening, that guest is Carlin Knight. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, where he received a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science and Economics. He also has a master's degree in international public management and policy and is pursuing further graduate studies in economics. He enjoys writing and is a former columnist for the Caribbean Times newspaper, as well as other regional publications. He has also been on several radio programs focusing on public policy, regional affairs, and politics. A proud product of Antigua and Barbuda and the Grays Green community, I'll also add that Carlin is what I would consider one of our young political analysts within the region. And let me tell you guys, we recorded this episode before, and technical difficulties meant that we had to re-record. If you do hear an echo, I apologize. It could not be helped, and this is what happens when we're doing long-distance interviews, especially in the current pandemic. Nonetheless, it was important to have Carlin on today to discuss the recently concluded general elections in Trinidad and Tobago. Carlin, welcome again.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here, Aurelia. No problem.
And while I say again, actually, cast your mind back when we did, and that would have been in season 2, when we discussed what next for the CCJ. Carlin was also a panelist on that segment. Anyway, to the business of today, I wanted to get an external view of the political situation, or the result of the recently held elections, because I know over the last month and a half you would have been inundated by local conversations, by the candidates and the political leaders and the platforms and the manifestos and everything else, very much insulated, very much inward looking, internal. And so maybe a perspective from the outside. Carlin is from Antigua and Barbuda, living abroad, and let me say or suggest he has no party card, he has no political affiliation to any of the political parties, any of the 19 of them in Trinidad and Tobago. And for want of a better phrase, he has nothing to gain. So you can be assured that the perspective is independent and objective. But to give you a little bit of background, of the 146 candidates from 19 political parties, and 4 of them being independent candidates, contesting the general elections in Trinidad and Tobago yesterday, August 10th, 2010, the results are in. Right? These candidates were vying for 41 seats, and the Prime Minister, or newly re-elected Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, declared victory at the polls yesterday at around 10:30 p.m., with the PNM taking 22 seats and the UNC taking 19. Carlin, I want to get from you your initial reactions to the result.
Yeah, so initially, I would say that I wasn't at all surprised that much by the result of the re-election. I think that I expected the PNM administration and the Rowley administration to be re-elected. Um, I was a little surprised that it wasn't a bigger margin of victory, and indeed, it seems as if they had reduced their, well, they know that they reduced their seat share, and it seems that their overall support in the election seems to have gone down. We haven't gotten the official figures yet, but just from looking at the results we've seen coming out on various media outlets, it seems as if it was a reduction in the support, and a slight swing towards the opposition. Um, I wasn't surprised, and I wasn't surprised because I think that there was several factors in play here. Um, one of which was an incumbency factor. So I think that um, people tend to give parties 2 terms, generally speaking, and then unless barring some huge scandal or some huge controversy, um, some major failing in governance, you tend to in the Caribbean see 2 term administrations. Um, and also, I think that the pandemic also may have played a factor. People either less enthused because of the pandemic to vote, or um, they. I often believe in the sort of stability theory, which is basically in the midst of a crisis, whether it's a war or a pandemic of this sort, people tend to look for stability and continuity, and so they tend not to want to disrupt uh, with a huge change in administrations during a crisis. So I expected to see Rowley return. They hadn't really been that much of a big governance failure. There was the whole Petrotrin closure, a few ministers that got dismissed from the cabinet, but nothing to my mind that would have, I think, raised to the level of um, dismissing them. So I wasn't really surprised by that. And from what I was hearing, it seems as if they would be returned to office.
Good. And in terms of as well, something that we discussed before, and I've always been sort of mindful or hesitant to raise this issue, and that is the that Trinidad and Tobago has historically, based on the trends that I've seen, leaned toward the PNM. Um, can you comment on that? I mean, for the majority
Yeah, yeah.
of
So 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 I would say that the PNM seems to be the party to beat in elections. I mean, it seems as if they uh, from the time the PNM was first created, they have dominated the politics of Trinidad and Tobago. That's a fair assessment. And you've had brief interruptions on the Panday and no the People's Partnership in 2010 2015. But if you look at the trend historically, the PNM has had um, um, has enjoyed continuous support. And if you look at the trend as well, the PNM seems to be the party that actually gets consecutive victories in the electorate. Um, I don't know that there's been a time the PNM has been in government only for one term. So it seems as if um, the PNM at least will get a two terms before there's any change in administration. Um, I think that it's interesting to look at that dynamic and to sort of assess why why the PNM seems to be able to get consecutive governance, whereas the opposition party um, um, did not manage to get re-elected in 2010 2015. And that might be some cause for reflection, right? So I think from my perspective, looking at it, I think the Prasad Pasesa administration 010 or 2010 2015 was beset and plagued by a number of what I would consider to be a very huge ministerial scandals and dismissals from the cabinet. There was a lot of turnover, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a lot of ministerial turnover. There was an issue with crime as well that led to a lot of the AGs being changed, or the ministers dealing with that situation being changed. Then there was a Jack Warner issue, um, and some. So there was a lot of, and then there was I think that the gentleman, the former sports minister, I forgot his name, that was dismissed as well. So I think there's a lot of sort of instability, you might say, in the coalition or the People's Partnership, and I think that might have led to them being ejected before the incumbency factor could take place, where you could get a second term in favor of the change in leadership of Dr. Keith Rowley as well in the PNM. I think also helped them to sort of project an image of where the party that's best placed to take Trinidad and Tobago forward.
Definitely, and as I alluded to before, in looking at the trend seems to be 2 terms PNM, 1 term UNC, 2 terms PNM, 1 term UNC, and of course, barring Dr. Eric Williams, who again has been our longest serving Prime Minister, or even longest serving head of government, even before when he was Chief Minister, Premier, from 1961 onward until the elections of 1981. He had served 4 consecutive terms. Then we had another PNM administration in George Chambers. Then we switched to the National Alliance for Reconstruction, or the NAR, which some of you may or may not know would have been led by A&R Robinson, of which Basdeo Pandey was a part. And then in 91, we saw our first Manning administration, In 2000, 5 years later, we had a swing towards the UNC, which was the newly formed party led by Basdeo Pandey, of course. Um, and then, even though he was re-elected in 2000, that term only lasted 1 year. So I still sort of call it relatively one term, six, over 6 years. Um, and then after Pandey, who was the only UNC only government,
Mm-hmm.
um, then we had again Patrick Manning in 2001, another short lived term because of that 1818 hung parliament situation. He
Mm-hmm.
was declared prime minister, but of course, the 1818 split forced us to go back to the polls, and it also forced us to increase the number of constituencies from 36 to 41. I'm not sure why it was an even number in the first place. And then we saw him serve 2 terms, 2002, re-elected again in 2007. So we've had four Manning wins. I would call it. I wouldn't call them full terms, but four Manning wins in our history. And then we saw that swing in 2010 to Kamala Prasad Bissessa. So when we came back with a PNM government in the form of a Rowley administration, I wasn't surprised that they would be given a second mandate. The question would be what that mandate would look like, how many seats, how big, how big or small their number would be in a second term. But it also prefaces something that I'll come to later when we get to what next in 2025. But the second thing I noticed, so apart from the trends in how we vote and how our administrations have run, is the local government elections of 2019. So I think oftentimes we use local government elections as a sort of temperature check in terms of governance and government and their favorability at the polls. So just December, we had local government elections, and I think those political strategists within the party would have seen that the PNM had lost some of their popular vote, so their popular vote declined by about 4.76%. The UNC, going up by about 4.48%. Interesting that the numbers don't match, off by a couple points of a percent, and maybe that might have been some delusions or disillusionment rather is the word I'm looking for. But even though there may have been some ground lost in terms of popular vote, they still managed to come out with an even split in the number of municipal corporations and still managed to win a majority, a simple majority of councillors in that election. But I think it would have signaled to any strategist that, listen, this 2020 election is going to be won. I mean, going to be won um, with a hard fight. That there was some elbow grease that needed to be put into the campaign, and so I wasn't surprised at the turnout, but definitely I knew that, and I mean, it's 2020, anything could happen, right? So I definitely knew that there might be some shifting sands, and it would be important to run, on both sides, a strong campaign. Um, I want to ask you as well, um, the outcome, because as I said before, we have 19 political parties contesting that last election yesterday. Are you surprised that we've come out with yet again, or maybe not yet again, but with a unitary opposition, the UNC only forming the opposition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm surprised, but I'm it's an interesting fact because I think when you look at the politics of Trinidad and Tobago, whereas the PNM has always been a sort of a solid unitary organization since its inception, what you had in Trinidad and Tobago coming out of the independent era was several parties or several groups or factions, how you want to describe it, trying to come together to topple the PNM and move it out of office. So you had the NAR in the initial stages trying to remove that sort of post Williams PNM, and then out of the NAR came the UNC, which formed. But then out of the UNC also came the COP, which formed.
Mm-hmm.
So you had this kind of a fractionalization of the opposition, and that led to a sort of a multi-party system for a lot of for a long time, which led ultimately to the coalition government in 2010, 2015, where the UNC strategically decided it would not field candidates in certain areas
Areas.
where the COP was running to give them a stronger chance of winning and so forth. And ultimately, you had um, um, this coalition, the People's Partnership, between the UNC and the COP. What you saw, I think, in this election was a return to maybe that Panday Manning era in the late 1990s, where you have now a solidly two-party system in Trinidad and Tobago, between the PNM on the one hand and the UNC on the other hand. Because if you look at the data, if you look at the numbers, it was a really disappointing night for third party candidates, especially I think the COP, which coming out of the 2010 elections, even prior to that, building momentum, going into 2020, being winning seats. They won several seats, and then coming now to, if you look at their performance in this election, it was a disappointing evening. They didn't do very well. So I think the UNC made a decision to field all candidates in every seat, and then people sort of made a decision that it was either going to be the PNM and the or the UNC, and they didn't really take on the third parties that much
Well,
this
that's
time.
interesting because in this election, and so we'll come to that discussion about the COP just now, but in that election, so the UNC only fielded 39 of 41 candidates, which is why we heard, talk on the ground that they would join. They of the two seats in Tobago, they contested none. So we heard and we saw little tidbits and sound bites that they might be joining with with PDP, an Indigenous Tobago party, to to control the house. And even then, we saw the leader of the PDP, Mr. Watson Duke, saying or supposing or suggesting, anticipating, unfortunately it didn't come to pass, but anticipating that Tobago would be the deciding factor in this election. I guess, the faith that he had in his party and his supporters was that they would win both seats or even at least one seat, and then perhaps form a coalition, or and maybe not a coalition, but align then in the House of Representatives with either the UNC or the PNM to be that deciding factor in terms of who forms the government. That was not to be. So we don't know whether or not there was a plan for coalition. I thought that that was interesting. And even with the COP before, and that partnership, because some of the parties that we saw in the partnership, like NJAC and the like, whereas they would have had a voice and a place in the 2010 election, they didn't make much noise in this election. And it's interesting as well, as I said before, not just the COP, but even, and not just the PDP, where, we had expectations, of them. And I think I saw some of the preliminary votes. It'll be interesting to see how the PDP stacked up in Tobago West and Tobago East in terms of if they really have the kind of support that they think they have. But we also saw, for example, the PEP, or the Orange Party, led by Philip Edward Alexander, who valiantly, I would say, contested 28 seats. And for a new party, because I wouldn't consider COP a new party necessarily, they've been out and participating in elections since 2007. But for a new party, for them to contest 28 seats, I think that that was valiant. They won no seats, but I mean, it's your first go around. The PEP, however, or rather, Philip Edward Alexander, the leader, I just add that caveat that he contested the elections of 2015 as an independent candidate. Then he formed this party to field 28, where others could not, So that was interesting. But to the COP, before we move on from this and the COP as a third party, because again, we hear all the old talk, all the exasperation. People are tired of the two parties and the main parties, the PNM and the UNC is not change, is exchange, and all the old talk that comes with it. But we've seen between 2007 and 2010, we've seen a proliferation of new parties, but somehow the support is not going behind them. And I always chastise the COP for not holding their ground, or maintaining their position, because when they came out in 2007, they were so impactful to the election, which is, I guess, what set them up or put them in a good position to be in a coalition come next election. But in 2007, they didn't win any seats, but in some constituencies, their performance was even better than the UNC. Of course, it wasn't enough to, and perhaps the PNM as well in some UNC safe seats. So as this third party, and one that I think a number of people had high expectations for in 2007, because of course their party leader, or the founder, Winston Dukaran, again was known in the public sphere. Of course, the COP came out of the UNC, so there was something to be said about that. However, I think a lot of people saw them as a good third option, a good middle ground. And I always hold the philosophy that 2020 would have been their election to win or lose, and unfortunately, I believe it was theirs to lose, because in 2010, in their second election, they made that mistake of not just joining a coalition, any coalition. I would have abused them the same way for joining any coalition, because you want to be seen as different and independent from the main parties, but then you sort of cannibalize yourself. The same thing that you came out of, the same thing that you said you no longer want to be a part of, you went right back in. And then we saw how that affected them in 2015, where even though the result was 23 for the PNM and 18 for the UNC, it was in fact 17 UNC and 1 COP. Of course, that one COP member didn't really make much of a difference in the opposition, unfortunately. So still we had a sort of unitary approach. And while we say in 17-1, it's really 16-2, because we had a COP member, or he went up on a COP ticket and then ended up somewhere midway between that term in the UNC. But, I think that they would not have won in 2007, they had no seats. In 2010, I believe that even though if they were not in a coalition, they would have won some seats perhaps. In 2015, I think they would have been able to effectively put up a fight to be an opposition party, if anything, whether it was against the UNC or the PNM. And then I think in 2010, they would have been that party to be the first third party to win the election. That was my philosophy. They went off course, but that's neither here nor there. But what I want to ask you is, in the context of this two-party system, and we shame a two-party system, and across the Caribbean we've seen predominantly two parties rising, and a number of them independence parties, and parties formed later on, but historical parties that have been there for decades. We've shamed having a two-party system, and we've always, again, that thing for a need for a third party, whatnot. But in the US, for example, there is a two-party system. So what is your take on a two-party system? Advantages, disadvantages,
Right. So
should we be upset about a two-party system?
Well, no. Well, I can imagine that some people will never, like the idea, because I think the difference with the two-party system in a larger country is that it's the two very large political organizations. So you never really get the same people at your local government that you get at the senatorial level, and that you get at the level of the president. So it's very easy to see that the politics in these larger countries will be different, despite it being two parties. The politics at the level of the, let's say, the Congress, and the party, the people who are contesting that election, are different from the level of the Senate and different level of the president, which is why you can have one party controlling the Congress, one party controlling the Senate, one party controlling the president, right? But in the Caribbean, it's a winner take all system, as we know, which is, I think, what Selwyn Ryan described it as, right? A winner take all. So when your party wins, it wins control of the government, it wins control of the appointments, the boards, everything. So it's a really intense battle. You are a bit slightly different to Trinidad because you're a larger country, so you have a much stronger local government presence. But in the small islands in particular, there's really very little local government. There are no mayors, there are no councillors, and so forth. And so it's really your party that wins all. In that
Mm-hmm.
context, I can imagine that there are people who say, there's no real difference because it's the same characters over and over again, the same people over and over again, and so we are very frustrated with the difference between parties. I think what helps with that is to try to have a competitive primary, such that you are at least able to change the actors, who presumably will bring with them new ideas and new policy directions and so forth, rather than have the same faces and same ideas over and over again. Um, but also, I think that one of the advantages of two-party system is that it renders stability. So we know, what once the political party wins the election, there is no debate about, what policies we're going to have to enact, because we're in a coalition with other groups of people, and they want different things, and they have different priorities, and have different constituencies to appease, and so we don't get a very cohesive set of policy making, because it's a lot of politicking and bargaining.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you have a two-party system, once the PNM wins, the PNM is going to enact its manifesto, its promises, and blah 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 blah. So there's predictability and there's stability. Um, and so from that sense, it's an advantage in system. I think as well the kind of political system that we have in the Caribbean renders a two-party result almost inevitable. Why I say that is because um, one of the things that it doesn't do for third parties is to look at the vote share. So it's a constituency-based electoral system, the FPTP, right? Except with the exception of Guyana. And I hope you can come and talk a little bit about the Guyana situation, because you see how that has been.
Mm-hmm.
But in the rest of the English speaking Caribbean, it's FPTP based, which is constituency based single member returning, which
First
means
past the post.
first
Yeah.
past the post. Sorry for
Mm-hmm.
the people at home. First past the post. So what that means is that your vote share is almost completely irrelevant. It's if you win. So if a person gets, let's say a third party gets 12% of the vote overall, right? Overall, 12% of the electorate supported this party. Um, but it didn't manage to get any sort of majority in any of the constituencies, it doesn't get into parliament.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas under a proportional system, which looks at the vote share, if you get 12% of the votes, you get 12% of the seats, which in the context of a 41 seat parliament might have at least been one or two seats, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't happen on the FPTP. So it shuts out
Mm-hmm.
third parties in that sense. But also, people tend to want stability, and they want not just stability, but they want to get a distribution of the resources.
Mm-hmm.
We know that in the Caribbean, once your party wins the election, it's sort of patron clientelism that goes on, right? So it distributes resources to its supporters. So people tend to look for the parties that they think have the best chance of winning the election.
Mm-hmm.
And
Overall.
overall, so even though I might like this guy and he's saying very nice things, he's very young, he's energetic, he's coming with fresh ideas, if I don't think that he has the ability to win, um, there is very little chance I'm going to support it. It's not in my interest to support somebody, even though I like him. I'm concerned more about who might be able to get into power realistically, and who might I'm able then to get some kind of help or assistance from.
Mm-hmm.
So people tend to gravitate then, and this then creates a sort of a dependency or anti or how should I put it? It tends to
A
favor the
reluctance.
established
Yeah.
parties, because
A
they have already
reluctance to
been
go further.
established. They already have the resources. They can mount a successful campaign. People tend to throw their money behind them, and so they already have that base of support. And so people kind of just get cynical and go, okay, I'm going to just go red or yellow, because
Mm-hmm.
um, one of the two of them is going to emerge the winner anyways, right?
Yeah.
So there is this inbuilt tendency in our region to have to favor two-party systems in a democracy.
Yeah,
So
or to at least be reluctant to vote for one, because
right.
and this is why I also mentioned the third parties, because and again the valiant effort that the PEP made, and it would be interesting to see what percentage of the overall votes that they got, and how they fared, and, once the results have been published,
Mm-hmm.
because they contested, I think, 28 seats, which
Mm-hmm.
for a third party is good. And when I say a third party, I mean a new third party, because of
Mm-hmm.
course we have others, but for new third party, that is good, because at least, if we are confident in that party, again, the leader is controversial, so I'm not commenting on, saying this is a hypothetical.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are comfortable with that party and you want to put your support behind it, you might feel that much more motivated because you say, aha, they are contesting 28 seats, so there is a possibility that they can, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you know, win a majority. But if you don't, if you need at least 21 to win and you don't have even 21 candidates, then people are going to be like, okay, well, how are you expecting to form a
Precisely.
government or form an
Precisely.
opposition?
On
And
your
I
own.
wouldn't have, yeah, I wouldn't have a say in what happens anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But when we talk about that, and again the fielding number of candidates and their electoral support, I want us to look at voter turnout. Now,
Mm-hmm.
before we look at voter turnout, one more point, because I want to highlight in terms of this two party system and that discussion. Um, just to sum up, it's more so not the number of parties but the system, because again, just to summarize, or a key takeaway is not that we have two parties, is what happens when we have those two parties, and how does the process work. And this might be a play into a session I want to have later on local government elections, and where electoral turnout is abysmally low, where there is a push to have, and even the Rowley administration had been pushing and doing consultations on increasing the powers of local government and local government
Mm-hmm.
reform, where this kind of thing, where you say, having those varied levels, and having a sort of different system or interaction, between central government and local government, might assist with some of the downsides of this two party system. But to voter turnout, right?
But before I go into just one
Go ahead.
second, there's one thing that I would say about minor parties. It's for me, in terms of the Caribbean, what I look at in terms of a minor party or a third party is not so much for them to win, but their
Mm-hmm.
impact insofar as determining the result. So being
Mm-hmm.
kingmaker, as it were, in any
Yes.
particular constituency. Because what a third party can do, particularly in the case of a splintering. So when you see, for example, a major party and they have internal factions and the party goes and forms a new party and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
that may pull votes away in the constituency, from that established party. So we may have seen that, for example, for when the UNC fractured kind of into the COP and so forth, and you saw the COP doing better, in some of the seats, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that has, and even though they did not win the seat,
Mm-hmm.
that may have an impact in
Impact on the
determining
outcome.
the outcome of the seat, because the votes that could have gone to the established party instead
Mm-hmm.
went to a third party because they took support away. So in that sense, you can't dismiss the role of third
The role.
parties
Mm-hmm.
in democracy, because they can easily determine, particularly in a very close election,
Race.
the
Mm-hmm.
outcome of
which
elections.
is which is true, and to even highlight, a notorious vote splitting party. I mean, apart from the COP, again, they would have been the ones, like it or not, that would have taken the rest of the partnership, the UNC, NJAC, MSJ, and the others in that partnership. I believe the COP was the kingmakers in that sense, doing some heavy lifting in constituencies where the UNC may not have won back in 2010. But to a notorious vote splitting party, or person rather, because I was going to call the Independent Liberal Party,
Mm-hmm.
that is
Jack
Jack
Warner.
Warner.
Mm-hmm.
And this time he went up for a constituency, Lopido Bonnet, and he, I would say, held his own,
Mm-hmm.
particularly for somebody who had not been in the political spotlight. I think for the last 5 years, we heard on and off from him on the other matters.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, he was defeated. But like you said, what impact did he have on the polls? Similarly, in Tobago, what impact did the PDP have on the polls? So it is notable, and that's always the concern when we have new parties and third parties, well, we can't even call them third because now there's so many.
Mm-hmm.
But when we have newer parties coming on board, the question is also, who are they going to take away votes from,
Mm-hmm.
and how would that impact? But in
Mm-hmm.
terms of voter turnout, so we have a total population of 1.39 million, 1,390 something thousand people in Trinidad and Tobago. Of that number, 1,134,136 people were eligible to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So again, 1.39 million total population, the electorate 1.1 million people. Now we don't know what electoral turnout was, but I think that that was significant. Just looking at that number,
Yeah.
so many
Mm-hmm.
people, eligible to vote in Trinidad and Tobago.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts?
Yeah, it's a definite largely it's a very big number. Um, I've always sort of been fascinated by the larger countries in terms of how they do the electoral systems. When you have, I mean, it's nothing compared to the bigger countries, like the developed countries, but it's still in terms of the Caribbean, you look like a country, my country, for example, which is 100,000 people, which in your
Mm.
case is probably just a minor town or something, where you have now
Yeah.
a million people. In Jamaica, you have 3 million people. So it's interesting to see how that works. Um, but I do think what's interesting is, though, despite the large number of people, despite the large people who are number of people who are eligible to vote, you actually look at the data and you look at the constituency breakdown and you see the people who are voting, you see the returns, um, and you don't get that similar reflection. For example, you're not
Mm.
seeing double digits and like digits in the fives or whatever, right? So you have a 20,000 plus victory, or a 10,000 plus. I mean, on occasion you may see that, but a lot of the people who are winning with a few thousand votes in most of the constituencies, right?
Mm.
And it's not that the constituency sizes are small, because in a lot of
Mm.
these constituencies you have a total number of voters of somewhere in the region of 25,000, 30,000 people, even more. So you're seeing what might be considered low voter turnout,
Mm.
or lower than perhaps you would expect, given the
Mm.
size of the
The
the the,
population.
the population, the people who are eligible to vote. Um, we don't have the numbers for this election, because it's not fully published yet, and I'm not really aware of the institutional knowledge, and perhaps you can shed light on that. But just from generally looking at the numbers that have been published so far, I'm thinking it's in the region of around 70% or thereabout. It doesn't seem to be in that high range that you'd get.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. When we look at the trends, and the episode before on the 33% and why you should vote, again, that 33% representing on average the percentage of the electorate that would not come out to vote.
Yeah, it's a pretty
Typically
sizable
our
number.
Yeah, typically our electoral turnout is in the 60s, high 60s, but 60s
Mm,
nonetheless. On
mm,
average, for the last three elections, it was about 67%,
mm,
with 2010 being one of the higher ones in recent times, with 69.88%
mm,
of the electorate coming out to vote. So it would be interesting to see exactly how hotly contested this election was, particularly when preliminary reports on the day of the polling, they were saying, oh, they're seeing a large turnout, and oh, there are people lined up for blocks, to vote. So it would be I'm keenly awaiting that electoral turnout figure to see how that has changed, because I think it says something about the current administration, or even in this instance, I will leave the suppositions for the data, but in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as in the rest of the Caribbean, we have this history, as they would say. I think it was Dr. Tennyson Joseph that had pointed that out initially in one of his papers, that we have a tendency to vote out governments rather than vote in governments. And so when there is a high level of displeasure, let's say, with a sitting administration, then people turn out to the polls in droves to get them out.
mhm. Yeah, so I think when you look at the data, you definitely do see that theory being borne out by the empirical evidence. So when you look at voter turnout in the region, um, in instances where you have had a change of government, you do see a spike in the voter turnout. In
Mm-hmm.
in a number of the Caribbean countries, I don't have the actual data in front of me, But when you actually look at it historically, um, when there is a change in government, it's also sort of strongly correlated with an increase in the voter turnout for that
Mm-hmm.
election. Um, and I think that is because people are mobilized and energized to get rid of a government they don't like. For example, in Barbados, that just recently voted out the DLP in the most
The Frontal Stewart
the
administration.
fund of Stewart administration in the most um, a very very outstanding way. I think for that country, it's the first time in their history they've ever had a complete whitewash,
Mm-hmm.
which is when a party wins all the seats. You did see a higher than usual voter turnout. So you see this kind of trend happening, and
Mm-hmm.
it would give evidence to the fact that people really don't get energized to come out if they believe a party is going to get a second term. If
Mm-hmm.
people just say, you know what, I think, okay, PNM has been in there, I might as well just gonna, might as well get a second term. I'm not really
Yeah.
that interested in voting in Kamala again. Nah, just give Raleigh a second term. And if that's the case, well, he gonna win anyways. Why am I gonna get excited to vote? So this is
Exactly.
how the kind of incumbency thing works, where people just kind of go like, blah, I'll just leave them in, as opposed to I'm gonna really
Vote
make an
them out.
effort
Yeah.
to come out and vote out.
Make a statement.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, and we saw that as well. As I mentioned before, in 2010 we had a peak, and in 2002 as well. But in 2010 we had, perhaps, by a couple of points of a percentage point, but 69.88% in recent history in the last couple decades.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been, one of our highest electoral turnouts. Beat only by 1961 elections, which again we understand because that was the independence
Mm-hmm.
elections
Yes.
of an 88.11%. But in 2010, when of course the exasperation or frustration with the Manning administration was made
Mm-hmm.
clear
Mm-hmm.
by people going out to the polls. But
Mm-hmm.
in the context of voter turnout, I also want to touch on something that I think is important in our conversation and in our dispensation when we look at 1.1 million people eligible to vote, when we look at voter turnout, whenever we get the figures, that kind of thing. The Prime Minister, I think by now, I don't know if it's safe to call him that, but the Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley, and I assume that even and until the president swears in, the EBC confirms this result and the president swears in the Prime Minister, I assume that he will continue to be the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, in his victory speech, so to speak, he said that the country's young people are largely to thank for the PNM victory in this 2020 election. Um, and I want to touch on that, and get your perspectives on the youth vote. Again, not just in the context of Trinidad and Tobago and our recently held elections, but overall. But before you get into that, I need to see the demographic data. Unfortunately, I haven't seen the EBC publish that kind of, at least for 2015, and 2010, publish that sort of data disaggregation. So, typically when you look at, say, other elections or elsewhere in the world, they will tell you, okay, the percentage of voters between
Certain ages.
XYZ
Mm-hmm.
is this, or the percentage of voters voting for Democrats is this and Republicans is that. We don't seem to publish that. Again, I will go back to the reports. I'm committing to doing that for you guys, but we haven't seen that as yet in our electoral reporting, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
But it is estimated that approximately 450,556 young people are between the ages of 12 and 29. Of course, we know you have to be 18 to vote,
To
but of
vote.
course, you know. But if we look at it as a group, then we know that there is some segment of that, in our target 18 to 30 population.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to get, and I mean, I do give credit to the young people. I must. I'm a young person myself. But I would like to see the data to back that up. And if it is perhaps one request immediately after election, let us work on our youth population and youth development data. Let us look at youth participation in the electoral process, because while they might
Mm-hmm.
participate in the politics, because we saw, there's this joke that Facebook was a UNC stronghold, whereas Twitter was a PNM stronghold, right?
Mm.
So we see them talking and we see them talking the politics, but I want to get that electoral data to see their participation.
Mhm.
But was it a youthful campaign? Definitely. We saw new ways to energize the public. So that is definitely there, but the data. So youth electorate and youth voting. Thoughts
So,
on that?
I'm in agreement with you certainly that we need to get the breakdown in terms of the data and the statistics and how are young people voting and to make some very concrete analysis. But I think one thing I will say is that the pandemic had a very unique sort of impact on elections. This is the first time in the Caribbean, at least that I'm aware, that we're having an election in this kind of situation where you can't, so we have to social distance, you can't have mass gatherings, you can't have crowds. The only similar thing to be would be an election during the hurricane season where you might have had a natural disaster, but even then you have an election after, right? And all the protocols, the health protocols, would have meant that you could not have the sort of regular mass canvassing, mass meetings that you would have had
Rallies.
and rallies and so forth. So what that meant is that you had to make use of social media as a primary tool of campaigning and a primary tool of getting out your message. And I think this has been a good thing because it has, to my mind, shifted political parties in the right direction. There's been a reluctance, and I know that they say that young people are not very engaged in the political process, and that the most dependable voters are your older generation of voters who will come out from 6 o'clock in the morning to go and vote for you and so forth. So there's a tendency to want to do politics in the same way in the Caribbean, which is the calypsos and the mass meetings and the same sort of messaging and propaganda and so forth. This has meant that political parties are now having to retool, reformulate their strategy for a 21st century dynamic, where a lot of people, not just young people, but young middle-aged people, but especially the young people, are on social media. And if you
Yeah.
want to get young people energized and involved in the political process, social media is where you're going to have to begin to target them, right? And I
Yeah.
think that in that sense, it's not surprising to me that you might say that young people were engaged in the process in this time around much more so than they would have been in earlier elections, because in this election, social media was the central platform through which political parties
For
were
delivery, yeah.
communicating their message. And this is the platform in which you get the most young people and the most cross section of young people. On Twitter, for example, you did see a lot of chatter about the Trinidad elections and so forth. And so I'm glad that that's happened, because now you're gonna see a lot more young people mobilized, because you see this now, this changing dynamic, the digital era of Caribbean politics. And I think that's only for the benefit insofar as youth mobilization is concerned.
Definitely. And in another episode, the episode after this, we'll get more into that local context, more into the campaign, and more into youth participation. But I also, because this period has also been one of, say, political awakening. Maybe being outside of it, I had a chance to really reflect on it. Again, in a different way than when you're in the midst of it, and I've come to a number of revelations. And I mean, in the first episode, I spoke to my philosophy of why sometimes campaigns are really just confirmation bias. It's not really, how many people are swayed by campaigns typically. Some revelations about tribalism and whether or not that is, in Trinidad and Tobago, just lazy political analysis. We're willing to chuck things down to, oh, it's just because of race, and not really get into the meat of the matter of why people vote the way they do at times versus at other times, why certain constituencies vote how they do. Another revelation about that same two-party system, where, look, comparatively, the issue is not whether or not we have two parties. Having two parties is not bad. I mean, there are states with singular parties. Of course, we have been told and we have been taught that is the devil itself, right? But then it's not about the number, right? It's about the process, right? It's about quality. It's not about quantity. And the other thing is that the one of my fifth revelations, about politics in Trinidad and Tobago, in this instance in particular, is that at times, and again reflecting on my own experience, at times you vote for a candidate, as in the MPs, the choices for MPs, and you make your decision sometimes solely based on who the MP is,
Mm-hmm.
or could be,
Mm-hmm.
or who you want to get out. At other times, you are forced to vote based on leadership. Who leads, or who will be the next leader, who might become prime minister. And then you have that segment of voting based on party, that what we call crapo in a seat politics, where if the UNC put up this person, regardless of who, what,
Mm-hmm.
when, where,
Mm-hmm.
why, we
Mm-hmm.
vote in UNC, and
Mm-hmm.
regardless of who, what, when, where, why, we vote in PNM. So there is that, yes, but I also feel like, again, in the analysis of things, that we also have to understand what motivates voters and what would affect a vote, right? Because we've seen those who did not like the MP, particularly in some marginal constituencies, and even in safe seats. There are those who said, listen, if you don't move this man from here or this woman from here, we will not vote you back. And we saw how that might have affected votes. We
Mm-hmm.
also saw that, listen, this person is performing. Why are you removing that? And we will come to Maruga Tableland in a minute, because Maruga Tableland said, we don't want this man here. They didn't listen. The PNM did not listen, and they, but
Mm-hmm.
we'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I want, when I said, different issues in terms of who we vote for. Sometimes we vote for the MP, and sometimes we vote based on party leader, or who will be the next leader of the country. And I think in this instance, as in 2010 again, it came down to the leadership of
Mm-hmm.
government,
Mm-hmm.
who people felt that they could put their faith
Trust.
in. And I even saw, which was interesting enough, I even saw a hashtag. And when we talk about leadership, and for we could lambaste, like I said, sometimes we have to separate party from person, because we could lambaste the PNM and Manning in some of his missteps, but he is also very much revered. And it's the same thing with Pandey. We could lambaste the UNC,
Mm-hmm.
and we could lambaste some of Pandey's missteps,
Mm-hmm.
but he is, especially now in his post-politics life, he is very much revered
Mm-hmm.
by all of Trinidad and Tobago, or the majority. I would say there might be still some bitter people in the UNC, but this one, interestingly enough, I say all that to say, I even saw a hashtag, for Manning 2020, in terms of, I don't know if you know that in Trinidad and Tobago, this idea of Vision
Mm-hmm.
2020 and the
Mm-hmm.
plan for Vision 2020 was
Manning,
championed by
man.
Patrick Manning.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we are in 2020,
Mm-hmm.
the Rowley administration coming in 2015, and for some reason my paws are raising. But coming into 2015 and assessing, decided to defer that by another 10 years, so now it's Vision 2030. But that Vision 2020, and
Mm-hmm.
again, we could say what we want about Patrick Manning, rest his soul. But that Vision 2020 must be, in my estimation, one of the most significant pieces of policy development, or policy statements, visioning,
Mm-hmm.
as the name suggests, foresight,
Mm-hmm.
that we ever produced in Trinidad and Tobago. And it was done in what was then a bipartisan approach, doing consultations from all sectors of society. You
Mm-hmm.
name it, it was covered in Vision 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we squandered that opportunity like we squander everything else, but I digress. But I saw some people, when we talk about leadership and this being an election of leadership, I think even that legacy of leadership from Patrick Manning also played a role at this being 2020 and a 2020 year. So I was very surprised to see this, these effigies of Patrick Manning, and these memes and posts, and um, it was it was interesting. But definitely was a race of leadership, in my estimation. I don't know if you have a different view.
Yeah, just on that point, I think you're right to point out that firstly, people vote for different reasons, and so it's very, very patronizing to say politics is tribal, and in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, just race driven. So black people vote for the PNM, and the Indians vote for the UNC. I think that you do see some elements of tribalism, but
Mm-hmm.
again, a political party is an umbrella organization. It captures multiple people. So you have your diehard people who will support you regardless, right? You have people who will, and they are important and they are needed because that is your base, that is
Mm-hmm.
your core constituency of support, right? Which every
Mm-hmm.
political party needs, right? Your fan base, as it were. But then you also have marginals, you have swing voters, you have people who are more interested in their constituency matters than they are interested in the general election and the overall issues. I don't like this guy you have put
Yeah.
in this constituency. You brought up is it Table and Maruga? That's the,
Moruga
and,
Tableland, yeah.
right. So that's one of the issues you can see. And then you also have, as you rightfully say now, issues of national direction, issues of governance, issues the sort of big macro policy issues,
Mm.
and importantly in that sense, the issue of leadership. Looking at the two candidates, looking at the two leaders of the party, and seeing which is the preferred leader. And I think in this election, I think people were more comfortable with Dr. Rowley as the prime minister than Mrs. Prasad Basesa. I think
Mm-hmm.
that there is still a lot of hangover from the 2010-2015 time that Mrs. Prasad Basesa has to begin to account for. I don't know that she has fully atoned
Atoned.
maybe for that period sufficiently. And a
Mm.
lot of people sort of raise their eyebrow. This is my perspective looking in, maybe
In
different,
yeah.
right? Um, Raise their eyebrows and go back to that again. Not really
Yeah.
sure I really want that, but so it is a question of leadership. I think when Dr. Rowley speaks, he also commands attention. He does carry that sort of weight and that sort of very serious, at the same time, very compassionate and very certain type of leadership style.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that people were drawn to it. And I go back to the point: in a pandemic, in a crisis, you also really want to see who's the leader that's going to bring you through to the other side. And people tend not to want to disrupt that system. So, given that leadership has been a question in this election, it may be. Well, I suppose we come to that later when we talk about the future. It may be
Mm-hmm.
a question for the UNC now to
Mm-hmm.
begin the soul searching process and to ask themselves whether Kamala Prasad Basesa is an asset or liability going forward
Right.
for this party.
Which is actually what we're going to come to now, because my next segue is in terms of this leadership and looking at how the leaders responded to the results. Of course, we know the victor, Prime Minister Rowley, said, and I'm quoting here excerpts from his speech after his statement to the press, and he said, "I will return to Whitehall as Prime Minister." And it was interesting, because even though I saw the media, one news station calling it the race to Whitehall. Whitehall is typically our seat of the Prime Minister, or office of the Prime Minister. I found it interesting that he said he would return to Whitehall, given that Whitehall had been under construction, or I should say renovation, because it is a historical building, one of our Magnificent Seven. So that plug there I thought was interesting, because the administration had done a lot for rejuvenating, renovating, refurbishing a number of our historical sites. So I think if it's one thing that they did right, I was right there with them on that. But anyway, he did say, of course, it was largely as a result of the involvement of young people, and he did warn us that there are difficult days ahead, that the next 2 years would be very difficult. In this period, more than any other, again quoting here, let us put aside personal slights, personal wants, and look at the national needs, especially of those persons who are least able to look after themselves. He went on to say that, and of course, that previous statement is in the context again of global considerations, as well as what they've been asking people to do from the outset. Remember, in 2015, their campaign was "Let's do this together."
Mm-hmm.
This sense of community, nationhood, patriotism, working together. But that's not the good part. The good part. So he said, "This could easily be my last term in politics." He said, as the longest serving member in Parliament, he said he is, sorry, the longest serving member in the parliament. And that it was important, paraphrasing here, to fashion the PNM's future by ensuring that our young people take on, greater responsibility. He said, and I quote, that this is a period of transition for the party, for the PNM. I am not one of those politicians who believe that when you come into office, you should go out feet first. And I thought that was interesting. in two things in terms of one, what I was saying before in terms of 2 terms PNM, 1 term UNC, 2 terms PNM, 1 term UNC, that perhaps this is again a matter of and a matter of political strategy. Now I don't want to limit it to political strategy, and I'll tell you why just now, but perhaps a matter of political strategy because he knows that by the end of this second term here, there might be some apathy or there might be some willingness
Mm-hmm.
or some intention to sway. So let's get a new leader in 2025 to reinvigorate,
Mm-hmm.
the party base and not the same old thing. But the second thing is why I wouldn't just blame it on strategy, even though it is a good political strategy. Um, I want to believe that he is sincere in saying that this might be his last term because I remember, and those of you who follow local news, in general, would recall that Dr. Keith Rowley has always said, I am not in love with office. I will do what needs to be done. And, for want of a better phrase, if you want to vote me out, vote me out, right? But I will do what needs to be done. And he said, I hope, when he was addressing, the cabinet, he said, I hope that none of you are in love with office, because we are here to do a job, that kind of way that, listen, we will do what needs to be done. If they think he said as well one time, I don't make policy based on winning elections. We do what we need to do, when we have to do it. And he said so even in this pandemic, even in the context of closed borders and the like, that we do what is best for the population of Trinidad and Tobago, and then the elections will see after itself. So I could very well see that it be in his second term and bowing out gracefully while on top, because some leaders really you have to drag them all kicking and screaming. But the second reason why this is important is that same thing that the conversation that you were gearing up for in terms of the UNC. Because even the PEP, that orange party, that newest of the third parties, their leader said, I said at the start of this campaign that win or lose, my career in active politics comes to an end. I meant it then and I meant it now. And essentially bowing out, having not won the election. And some people might say he gave up too soon, but he had been, to his defense, in politics for, he said, 26 years. He has been a member of every party under the sun, but that's not the point, until he formed his own. But he bowed out too. But we see that former Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar may not be going that same route, where after electoral defeat you bow out. In fact, can we expect a resignation from her even after this recount is over? Should we expect it?
um, I think, I think, I say two things here. We don't have a culture in the Caribbean of accepting responsibility for electoral defeat
Or anything at all, but go
or
ahead.
anything at all. But certainly in the context of elections, in the UK, I contrast. In the UK, they have such a polite culture where, and because it's so competitive, if you lose an election, the night of election, we don't get into the nitty gritty of why we lost, how we lost, could we recount, could there have been some. If you lost the election, you go before the party, you go and make a national speak, you concede defeat, and you say, I will leave now and allow the party to begin the selection for a new leader. And it happens every single time.
Mm,
And a leader loses the election, whichever the party, the Labour Party or the Conservatives. In the Caribbean, not so much.
mm,
We have people who lose two, three, four times. They come back again. Um, in this election, I think that initially there is going to be a reluctance to concede and to walk away because there is somewhat of a measure of trying to save face and trying not to let down your supporters too much. The first thing you don't want to talk about, I think, is the idea of I'm going to be leaving now and I'm gone and this is it. Unless it's a really really bad defeat and you can't do anything about it.
mm,
When it's a sort of a marginal victory like this, you have supporters who are still looking at you with hopeful eyes and expectations, even though
mm.
it's unrealistically not possible. So you do this sort of political stumping, the political rhetoric. We're going to challenge them in the courts. They've stolen the election.
Yes,
We're going
go
to have
ahead.
a recount. Sort of political stumping that we've become accustomed to. I think this is the period the UNC is going through right now, where they're not ready to concede yet because they're still trying to make their supporters appeased. I think once the dust of the election settles, however, there's going to have to be a very serious conversation about the future of the UNC and who is best prepared to lead it. And I think in that sense, the hope and the expectation is that Mrs. Prasad Bissessa will go peacefully without
Mm-hmm.
much disruption. It's very difficult for me to make a prediction because I'm not intimately aware of the politics of the UNC. What I
Mm-hmm.
do think is that this is Prasad Bissessa's, I think, third election or fourth election as leader, third election, and she's only won once. I mean, so it's a question of, you know, and she's also getting, she and Keith Roy are on the same age, so it's really a question of, is she best placed to lead the party? I think she
Mm-hmm.
will reflect on that. I think her advisors and the people around her will reflect on that, and she may not go in the immediate sense, but I think at some point before the next election there may
Mm-hmm.
be a change, I believe, within the UNC. And one of the issues that I had with Mrs. Prasad Bissessa, I think, and this is not a reflection on women in politics as such,
Mm-hmm.
because I think you have outstanding leaders in Caribbean politics who are women. Mia Motley, Dame Eugenie Charles, and of course in Jamaica we had Porter Simpson Miller. I think Mrs. Basad Bissessa did not put a stamp of authority on her party and indeed on the country in the way that other leaders have, and other even Basir Pandey, I think, was a far more forceful presence than she was, for me at least. And so, in terms of the leadership style, the she seemed to be far more of a conciliatory, far more, letting other people sort of take the spotlight. And that has its advantages because it does render you to be a very amicable leader. At the same time, I think we like the idea of the maximum leader in the Caribbean. We like the idea
Mm-hmm.
that people can be, as you said, uh, um, this idea of leadership and forceful presence in sort of, brand name politics. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know that she commanded that kind of authority, that kind of presence nationally, and that kind of presence,
Mm-hmm.
to my mind. I think that the first that her election victory in 2010 was frustration with the Manning administration, and she becoming leader as a sort of a compromise candidate, and people saying, okay, maybe let her go forward.
Let's
But
try this. Yeah.
but as someone who was just, undoubtedly that individual, I'm not sure that that's person. And so there is going to be a conversation, I think, in any post-election defeat about who's best to take over. The question the UNC has to ask itself, and this is one of the issues in the phase of carrying democracy, is that we don't really prime new people because we're afraid of a challenge, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's not much of a succession planning that goes on. So there's no immediate, to my mind, at least looking in, counterfactual to
Yeah.
a Kamala Prasad successor. Who is the counter? Is it Mulal? I don't know. So who is the person that you would say commands that sort
Yeah.
of presence in the UNC to do that?
I think.
I think
Yeah.
just one more. I think by contrast, I've been looking at this Keith Rowley administration, and I see that everywhere Keith Rowley goes, that gentleman Stuart Young goes with him. He, I see the two of them just lock in step with one another, and I think that is, to my mind, an indication of where his head is at insofar as succession. It may not be, but it seems to be that kind of priming, that kind of grooming. He's taken a lot of leadership roles, a lot of responsibility. He seems to be trusted a lot as a young, up and coming person. There may be others, but you see this kind of dynamic. I'm not sure that that kind of dynamic happens in the UNC. So it'd be interesting to see what next and who next going forward.
Yeah. I think for the UNC, I think it is definitely a reckoning that they have to have with themselves because the challenge for them now is that 2020 was also, again, despite the trends and whatnot, they could have put up a much more valiant fight had they
Mm-hmm.
changed leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I think after, and we spoke to the fact that this would be the third election with Kamala Prasad Bissessa as leader, having lost two, only winning that one in 2010. But that is the third general election with her as a leader
Mm-hmm.
because we saw in the lead up to 2015 even all the signs were there. Having lost, I think they counted it out for 5 elections, right, under her leadership before you got to general election of 2015. And so the same way where we use local government as a temperature check, the same way that local government election should have been signal enough for her and for the party that, listen, something is happening in our base of support, something is happening in our camp that does not sit well with the electorate, and they did not heed that warning then. Then they went into 2015 with Kamla Persad-Bissessar and lost. They had internal elections in December of 2015, and again, I don't know who is advising the party. I often say that, that would be, for want of a better word, exciting, for me, if I were to be a political advisor, because clearly the moves that they're making seem to be a number of missteps. So I often question who is advising the UNC, because they would have told them that in this internal election in 2015, December of 2015, a couple months after the poll, that they should have removed her from office in order to allow the sort of re-energizing, the rebranding of the party. Because even though she may not have been, and the jury might still be out on that, even though she might not have been the perpetrator of some of these scandals, it happened under her tenure, and her administration is what has sort of been branded with it. Similarly, I think in terms of who next, I don't know if Rudal Monilal will even survive that 2010-2015 branding, because he was also
a part of it. Yes, exactly.
A senior member, as well as a close advisor, confidant, and buddy of Persad-Bissessar. So after several losses, now I don't know how many losses it has been since that first victory in 2010, but I think the time to remove, and yes, so you're going to do the recount, great. Hopefully that recount period is a time for them to get their statement together, or even to figure out what to do next. But I feel like the time is now or never, because as long as she is in opposition, and as long as, say, Rudal Monilal continues to be a senior and face of the UNC, then all the scandals of her administration will always be on the front table. Because people say, the PNM always blaming Kamla, the PM always blaming Kamla. You never hear anybody blaming Basdeo Pandey because he gone. You never hear anybody blaming Patrick Manning, because they, in order to shut down that legacy, you might have to chop off the head of the snake.
Certainly.
And so it's now or never. They missed their chance in 2015, because I always said the mistake they make in December 2015, they initially had 4 candidates for internal elections: Kamla Persad-Bissessar, Rudal Monilal, Christine Nawalo Hossain. She was a new member, new to the public as well in that 5-year period, and Vasant Barath. And I felt then, as I felt now, had they changed leadership, and had they picked Vasant Barath, although he did not have a seat in the House, they should have brought him in the Senate, then he would have been, or he would have put the party, and I mean, I think he would have put the party in a better standing, a better light throughout this term, for people to start to try to forget. Before you go on, even in terms of the PNM and that outright statement of grooming people, he said, to take on greater responsibility and grooming people for leadership. I think there too, in their internal elections, leading up to the 2015 polls, I think that was at the beginning of the 2015 period, when Rowley was selected, he did have a challenger. It was interesting to see her return, and I'll talk about that some in the next episode, which was Penelope Beckles. So she challenged him for leadership, because of course after Patrick Manning there was a void, leadership elections, who's going to be Rowley and Beckles, and of course Beckles, we know, went on to be ambassador to the UN. So you know what they say about when they ship out ambassadors, or when they ship out former MPs, and that kind of thing. But it was interesting to see that under Rowley administration, they brought her back to contest the Arima seat, which she of course won. And so the question in my mind is, are they grooming her
Mm-hmm.
for leadership?
Perhaps too.
And yeah, and then even in terms of, as you said, with Stuart Young, we saw his term, I think 2010 to 2015. I'm trying to remember. I know he came in as an MP. I want to believe it was in 2015. Either way, he was new, definitely in the last decade, to the political scene. And like you said, we've seen him do yeoman service for the PNM. We've also seen Faris Al Rawi.
Mm-hmm.
Initially,
Mm-hmm.
that was the talk of the town, that the Attorney General then,
Yeah.
who might continue to be the Attorney General, that he was being groomed. But you see that there are a number of possibilities
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
for leadership, and I
Yeah.
think that may be what they do well in terms of strategy, because I may not be priming you for leadership at the next internal elections in terms of within the party, but this experience that you're building now may not help you in 5 years, but in 10 years
Mm-hmm.
or in 15 years, you'll be able to look back at it and say, yes, well, he was XYZ. And it's the same thing again before we move on, because I know, guys, that we've been chatting for over an hour now.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move on, and it's that same thing where when you see them take a young person like Shamfa Kajo
Mm-hmm.
from Tobago, and you see them, even those who had not won their seat in the elections of 2015, and they sort of give them a turn
Mm-hmm.
in the Senate,
Mm-hmm.
so that they could understand and see how the machinery works.
Mm-hmm.
You see a kind of, again, I don't want to call it a mentorship or training program, but you see that kind of, okay, even with JW, because taking him out of the entertainment industry, the media industry, and even before the election, they had a vacancy in the Senate, and they put JW there again to put in the public's mind, to show him in a different light, I think, in the mind of the public, that look,
Mm-hmm.
yes, he's a media personality, yes, he's an entertainment, but look, you can see him now. You don't have to imagine what he will do if he elected, blah blah blah. You see him in the Senate, and so it changes the voters' perspective, so that again, they could pick from any and everything. But we don't know what will happen with the UNC. We know that it is solely up to them. We can only suggest, make suggestions, say what our predictions might be, if they change, if they don't change. But the results are in, and we see that Kamala Persad-Bissessy is not going down without a fight. She said that she will be asking for a recount. We also saw, Carlin, that even before the votes were finished, even before the polls closed, the Attorney General did say that they will be filing an election petition, that is the PNM, against the validity of UNC candidate Barry Padarath
Mm-hmm.
in his constituency of Princestown. Any thoughts on this call for recount or election petition?
I'm not familiar with the idea of is it like he has dual nationality or something? Why? What is the?
No, the challenge is that they are saying that he did not file the appropriate papers with the EBC, or there was
Ah,
some
okay.
error or issue with his nomination form,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore he should not be.
A
And I
candidate.
mean, this came up even before, since about the 17th
Mm-hmm.
of July,
Mm-hmm.
when we had nomination day. But it came up before, and it is a matter that we will see whether or not they decide to go through with that election
Mm-hmm.
petition or not. But this call for a recount, she said she's recounting 3 seats, but she hasn't told us
Which ones?
which
I
three.
noticed that.
We assume we we assume that it is marginal seats. And she said they were still going through the data. She's not given up that easily.
I think a lot of it is posturing. I think Mrs. Basavas, I think, who had said something to the effect of that she's going to drive out the PNM in the first term or something like that, when she lost in the first year when she lost
Mm.
in 2015. I mean, they won't laugh. So, I mean, we hear this kind of rhetoric coming from losing parties. We don't have, sadly to say, a very graceful
Exit.
election cycle in the Caribbean. Even a
Mm.
case where, in St. Kitts, for example, the Labour Party just got a massive throbbing. I think it
Mm.
was 11-2. Um, they're still saying, they're still claiming that they're going to challenge this. They're going to look at the results because it was fraud and all of it. And I'm not disputing the fact that there may have been issues in the election. I'm not disputing the fact that there may be legitimate reasons to challenge a seat or to look for a recount. I'm saying this has become so much part of the political melodrama that
Mm.
people really don't believe you because it's something that's just custom as opposed to being serious, right?
Yeah.
So it's like crying wolf. So every time you lose, you kick up a storm,
Mm.
you throw a tantrum in the first, let's say, couple months until you go, and then they always end up swearing in parliament. We're not always, they say we're going to protest, we're not going to take up our seats, and then all of a
Mm.
sudden they're swearing in and they're showing up to parliament for debates and so forth. So it's always just, I think, a part of the political culture, the political melodrama of the
Mm.
Caribbean politics, where you see when a political party loses, rather than saying, you know what, we made tactical mistakes, we apologize, and we'll do better, we're
Mm.
just going to say they stole the election from us
Yeah.
and we're going to challenge it. So I don't think anything will come of these recounts. I think what we see will be, at the end of the day, the
What we
composition of
get.
the parliament for the next 5 years, barring any unforeseen circumstance.
Definitely. And in terms of the outcome as well, we saw that the PNM, in the last election, they had 23 seats. They've lost a seat, and that is the Maruga Tableland seat. In the last election, for those of you who might not know, that was contested by the PNM, and Dr. Lovell Francis won that seat. It is a marginal seat, so the margin of the vote isn't that large, the difference in voting. But just to tell you, so Lovell Francis, who is of the PNM, he won the seat with 51.15% of the votes. We had an ILP candidate and we also had a UNC candidate, gaining just about 48.62% of the votes. Now, they decided in 2020 to remove Lovell Francis as the candidate and put instead Winston Gypsy, as he is known, Peters. Of course, he's a former Calypsonian, etc., etc. Um, he is formerly of the UNC and
Ministry.
served in the partnership
Mm-hmm.
administration.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to have your thoughts on this crossing of the floor and how, in this case, it may have backfired for the PNM,
Mm-hmm.
losing this marginal seat that could have taken them back to that 23 that they had before.
I think it had an impact. I think for sure, it had an impact. I think that it's not by chance that you lose. The seat you lose is also the seat with a controversial candidate in it. It just doesn't add up. I was even reading the analysis of some of the commentators on it, and they were saying that the young lady who won, she lives in the constituency. This guy, Mr. Peters, doesn't live in the constituency. She lived
Mm.
in the constituency. She was a councillor in the constituency. She's well known, and they were very clear that this was not the candidate of their choice. And so I think this was a clear case of, going back to another discussion we had, people making a decision based on who is running in the constituency, not
Mm.
so much at the PNM, right? I think if the PNM had a different candidate, they may have been able to retain, or even if they kept the same guy, they
Exactly.
may have been able to retain that seat. Now, I don't know what are the rules for selection of candidates in PNM.
Mm.
If it's a primary process, obviously you're challenged by a primary candidate, and if you
Mm.
lose the primary. But if it's a case where the party exercises some control overall about
Mm.
the direction of who they choose in a particular constituency, as you know, sometimes the party executive may have a veto power to say, okay, you're not going to be the
To
candidate,
say yes or no, yeah.
right? I think it was a very risky gamble that didn't pay off well. Sometimes, based on the strength of the character, you can switch from one party to the other, and people
Yeah.
go, okay, we still like
Go
you,
with you, yeah.
right? So some people have that ability. But I think in this case, he was also part of that same 2015, 2010, 2015 cabinet that was very controversial. Wasn't he
Mm.
also, I think, at one point dismissing the cabinet or something? I don't remember exactly. I think that,
So many, yes, so many,
but
so many,
there
so
were
many
issues
scandals, so little time.
with that KBB administration, and I don't know what was the wisdom taking on. If you want to take on somebody who comes crosses the floor, fine, we welcome you with open arms. But to put you as a
Mm.
candidate, why? And then he's also someone who's quite, I'm not ageist in a sense, but he was, to me, someone that did not bring much value to the party to be a candidate. And I think it's one of the mistakes that they're going to have to reflect on and accept, that this was just
Definitely.
not a good choice, and it was clear.
Choice. And I think, I don't know, and again, I don't know what happened at the screening committee. I don't know what happened at the constituency executive. I don't know what happened at all in terms of how they came up with this result, because from all social media reports, at least, and again from the constituency themselves, they weren't happy. The members in the constituency weren't happy with his selection, and I think many of them would have preferred that the former MP, or the MP in that 2015 2020 period, that he was retained. And again, like I said, from social media reports, from what we've seen, he's been working. I think he lives in and around the constituency, or
Hmm.
somewhere close
Hmm.
by. I believe he was active in terms of community events,
Hmm.
running a soup kitchen, doing this, that, and
Hmm.
the other. When they had the flooding incident, of course, he was toting mattresses on his back, that kind of thing, helping his
Hmm.
constituents. So again, when you remove a performing MP, and again, like I said, from the outside looking in, because I'm not familiar with his work in the constituency in any in-depth way, but from the outside, from what I've seen, he has been working. When you remove a working MP, that's one, you will get people who are disillusioned and apathetic. But then two, you've come in now with a new candidate that we tell you we don't like. So I was not surprised
Hmm.
about that. It was a disappointment for Dr. Francis. I believe that he should have been put again. And then if the constituency don't want him, let them say that, and then come in 2025 now with a new candidate then. But if somebody is performing and they have the backing of the executive, then why change? And like you said, what value in crossing the floor? And again, you can be a member, you can leave up one party and go to the next, that's no problem. But when you hold high profile positions in certain administrations,
Hmm.
or even public positions, then you have to now question, when I take this person on board, not just as a regular member, but now you're putting him up as a candidate,
Hmm.
then A, what message does that send to our supporters?
Hmm.
And B, what value does this candidate bring? So maybe there is some hidden value that we don't know about, but I couldn't see it on the face of it.
Hmm.
I will tell you that he was appointed chairman of the NCC during this PNM tenure, which I thought surprising given that he was with the UNC before. But I know that they have this history of taking a bipartisan approach, particularly in sectoral matters, or,
Hmm.
Rowley always talks about relying on the experts, or relying on the evidence,
Hmm.
so that he is a man who has been steeped in Trinidad and Tobago culture and has
Hmm.
been a contributor to our culture for decades. Yes, so I could understand if you give him chairman of the NCC. I understand that. If
And
you give him
NCC being an
a seat,
acronym for what? Sorry.
sorry, the National Carnival Commission,
Okay. Okay.
right? Or if you put him on a state board, or if I could understand that. But then to take him from another party, the main opposition party, and put him in the parliament, on that, I just couldn't see it happening, and they paid the price. But we spoke to, again, this thing about election petitions, and the recounts likely being in marginal seats, and she said, oh, they won by the PNM would have won in those seats by small margins. I don't know what she considers small margins, but okay. Especially given the trends in those marginal seats. But let's look then at this issue of observers.
Hmm.
So typically we have observer missions, and this is across the Caribbean.
Hmm.
And the general practice over the years is for external observer missions to monitor parliamentary elections, not local government elections, but parliamentary elections, to ensure that the results reflect the will of the electorate.
Hmm.
And so these observers are typically observing the process as well as the counting. When I say the process, I mean on polling day. You might see them, at polling stations, observing, how the process is carried out, and the counting, and
Sure.
whatnot.
Sure.
How, in your opinion, does the absence of observers affect the election, or even the validity of the outcome?
So
Because
you
I
didn't
would
have
say that,
you didn't have observers in your elections this time around?
well, this year, of course, because of the pandemic and the closed
Ah,
borders,
yes, I see. I see.
the observer missions, and unlike St. Kitts, I would say, I would give them that in this instance. So in St. Kitts, I remember they rescinded the offer, the rescinded the request for observers.
Hmm.
In Trinidad and Tobago, they invited observers shortly after the announcement of the election date was made.
Hmm.
They did send communication to CARICOM and Commonwealth Secretariat for observers. Note here that they did not request OAS observers.
Hmm.
Needless to say, Of course, those observers would have had to have been in Trinidad and Tobago for at least 14 days
Mm-hmm.
before the conduct of polls so they could do the mandatory quarantine.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think the exemption would have been an issue. They were requested to apply for the exemption. I think as a matter of process,
Mm-hmm.
send me the names, tell me who's coming, what flight they come, that kind of thing. But I don't think that they would have been denied an exemption. But they would have definitely had to have come in 14 days before, do their quarantine, and then do their work. Of course, the Commonwealth Secretariat said that it was, and this is according to reports in the newspaper, according to what Dr. Rowley said, he said that the Commonwealth Secretariat declined to, or not, decline might be a strong word, but that they could not mount a mission, the cost associated with it, etc., and the logistics, of course, coming from across the Commonwealth, their observers and their staff coming from the UK. And the CARICOM, I'm not sure what the issue was with CARICOM, but I don't think CARICOM sent an observer mission either.
Mm-hmm.
So does this impact the election or the validity of the outcome of this election?
I don't think it impacts it in a very, very significant way. I think observers really are great because what observers really do is just to point out any irregularities that may exist. So if there
Mm-hmm.
are irregularities that are existent, I think that the political parties themselves is in their interest of pointing them out, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's always a good idea to have independent observers looking at your elections,
Mm-hmm.
because of course they may see things that you don't see and they may point out
Mm-hmm.
reasons and so forth. It's always an advantage to democracy. But these are indeed very strange and unique times. And I can imagine for someone like the Commonwealth, I could understand the logistics of that, having to send people, whereas you could send them for in regular times a day or two, and then bring them back to the UK, or rather they tend to use people within the region. But still, it's
Mm-hmm.
very costly to have to quarantine 14 days and so forth, and pay their accommodations and all the rest of that.
Accommodation. Mm-hmm.
So I can imagine that this is a very unique time and very costly time to do that. So I think that it would have been useful and very nice if they had given them some relaxation or some accommodation or some exemption, given the
Mm-hmm.
seriousness of the election and given that these are individuals who who are important to the functioning of your
Mm-hmm.
democracy, that this
But
could
I
have been
would,
made. But I don't think it had
but
a
I would,
material impact.
yeah, but I would disagree with relaxing the restrictions because again, let's be real about the political
Right.
situation. If nationals are being forced to
No.
quarantine
Okay.
and I mean this is standard practice around the world. The quarantine period is typically 14 days.
Hmm.
I think then you would have another faction of the population saying, "How come you've
Yeah.
relaxed the
Yeah.
restrictions for
Yeah.
these people and you
Yeah.
didn't?" I also saw some reports about them having to quarantine at their expense, and some people saying, "Oh, the government didn't want to pay for them to think," and again, not recognizing that governments don't pay because again, that would also be a conflict of interest. A government or an administration can't
Paying
pay
for your
for an
observers, exactly.
observer, far less for the accommodation,
Hmm.
etc. So I think it is that kind of strange time. I don't know what could have helped the situation. I don't think that the reduction, and again, we are dealing with a pandemic, and if we have, because they might have observers coming from close by or nearby Commonwealth countries, but they would have to send a staff team as well
Hmm.
who are
But the question
largely
is whether or
based
not
in the
they couldn't.
UK.
Well, the question is whether or not they couldn't have used individuals who are resident in the country as observers, who are already living there,
But
who are
right,
not
but then
citizens necessarily voting, and also that national governments who have embassies located in Trinidad and Tobago
mm,
could have
to
used
act
their
as,
ambassadors to act as sort of independent observers
I think,
reporting as well.
right, I think the former may have been difficult because again, this thing about living in a small country, and this thing about again the politics of the day, I don't think you could have taken Jane Doe or John Doe, Trinidad and Tobago citizen, and made them an observer,
No, no,
and
not
call them
citizens
an
of Trinidad and Tobago, more so expats living in Trinidad and Tobago, from Commonwealth countries or from not necessarily citizens, but people who are already there, maybe for work engagements and so forth, honorary councils and
callers.
so forth. I don't know the situation, but
Yeah,
I'm just trying to look at
yeah.
solutions.
I think having and again in terms of the diplomatic staff, high commissioners and that kind of thing, yes, I would say yes
Hmm.
because they do maintain some level of
Neutrality.
independence, neutrality, and being there again. not for the purpose of um, I should say for their own purpose rather,
Mm-hmm.
seeking their own interests or their
Mm-hmm.
own country's interests. So you would hope that they would lean on the side of neutrality, even though, I mean, you could say that even I probably shouldn't say that, but you could say even with the US, they might have a particular
Mm-hmm.
preferred outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, governments do. They don't say, they don't voice it, but thing. But regular expats, I don't think so, because we also have that situation and this whole debate about the 1%, and so
Mm-hmm.
people,
Mm-hmm.
it's just so warped the
Deception.
conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I would have hoped that CARICOM would have at least sent what be being near sure that they would have at least sent a mission, but also within our electoral process, there are observers,
Mm-hmm.
right?
National observers.
Observers are, yeah, they're observers. There are observers built into the system, and you have your parties being able to send, your a representative
Mm-hmm.
in each division to view the counting of ballots and whatnot and whatnot. And if you can't even trust the people in your own party to say yes, it went well, or no, it didn't,
Mm-hmm.
then what we doing?
Mm-hmm.
But let's take a regional approach. I mean, we've been here, we've been chatting for quite some time, and we are wrapping up, guys.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so much to talk about, so
Mm-hmm.
much to get through. But we're going to talk about leadership. Coming back to this point about leadership, let me tell you. So I woke up early this morning, and I mean, I'm supposed to be on leave, but I woke up, and when I say early, I mean 8 something,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I woke up, and I looked at the results because, as I told you all before, I don't like to watch the counting. My blood pressure cannot take it.
Yeah.
So I quite typically try to go to sleep early.
Mm-hmm.
But I woke up, and then, I was like, okay, I saw the results, I engaged with some of the content, looked at the videos, what was supposed to be a concession speech, but wasn't a concession speech, and the victory speech, and, some of the
Sure.
media reports and
Sure.
that kind of thing, read the newspaper, and then a couple hours, maybe 2 hours after, like, I literally jumped out of my chair. I had a little outburst, because then I realized that between 2020 and 2025, it means that Trinidad and Tobago, under the leadership of Dr. Keith Rowley, will not only celebrate our 60th anniversary of independence. Of course, at our 50th, we had a Kamla Prasad Bissessa government, so it will be interesting. And again, they did a good job, I would think, in commemoration of that, but it would be interesting to see how this 60-year anniversary would be celebrated by a PNM party, given that the PNM would have been the inaugural administration. But more importantly, I realized that Trinidad and Tobago, under the leadership of Dr. Keith Rowley, will assume chairmanship of CARICOM
Mm-hmm.
from January 1st to 30th of June in 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we held chairmanship under a Kamla Prasad Bissessa administration back in 2013. But this year, of course, we know that, and I mean, I often talk about parties in the region, and particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, not having any major philosophical differences to say one is more conservative and one is more, left wing, or how you
Mm-hmm.
can separate
Yeah.
U.S. politics in
Yeah.
terms of right to
Ideological
bear
differences.
arms, or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, ideological and philosophical differences. In Trinidad and Tobago, I often say that we don't have that, but we have thematic issues where certain parties stand, or where certain parties have a better record than others.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of regional integration, the PNM party has a better track record in terms of regionalism and promoting regional integration, as opposed to a UNC administration. I'm not sure and maybe I should do some deeper analysis on that. I'm not sure what the issue is, or how that came about, but definitely excited to see what, especially Dr. Rowley, because he has been a staunch integrationist, to see how that would play out. And I mean, even in the 2015 administration, he retitled, I should call it, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, now Ministry of Foreign and
CARICOM
CARICOM
affairs.
Affairs,
Mm-hmm.
given that sort of importance to CARICOM, and that hopefully in this new administration, it would mean that they would actually give them enough staff to do the work. But that's a different story. That's a different story. To make the affairs a little more people to handle the affairs. I digress. But they will also, under his leadership, celebrate the 20th anniversary of the signing of the revised Treaty of Shagarama. So a number of big ticket items, big things happen, and it would be interesting to see if we could make any headway, what kind of headway we could make under his leadership, um, you know, as a regional body.
Mhm.
But speaking about regionally, and you can comment on that as well as, even in that leadership, he will face some issues. I mean, we in the context of a pandemic, one pandemic, and then we have the airline industry. And I know you're from Antigua,
Mhm.
so the discussion about Liat
Mhm.
is for another matter.
Mhm.
But we know that that is still ripe,
Mhm.
still
There.
ongoing. So in the context of pandemic, in the context of what about regional travel, what will happen, in the context of even Antigua and Barbuda is hosting Carry Festa in 2021, so a number of things, and
Are
like I said,
happening.
a regional integration agenda, he will
Mhm.
lead on that. um, so it's interesting, and it will be interesting to see that. So I invite you to comment on that, as well as regional elections that have gone this year and that will come. We had Guyana, we the whole saga in itself, St. Kitts and Nevis, Suriname, and then to come we have Belize right on our heels, St. Vincent and the Grenadines coming, Ralph Gonzalez, another staunch integrationist, current chair of CARICOM. Um, then, and again, whether or not this is, he will contest the election again, because this is what his fourth term. Then we have Jamaica in February 2021. So thoughts on our Rowley leadership at CARICOM, or Rowley as chair, because I don't want to say leadership, because all of the heads of government bring something and they're responsible for leadership in the regional context, but taking on that chairmanship, and then regional elections, um, that have gone and that are coming, you know,
Mhm.
this year.
Mhm. Okay. So I think Dr. Rowley is going to face a CARICOM that is engaged in a very active period of its history in terms of regionalism and regional affairs. The biggest issue and most pressing issue for any CARICOM chair right now is the COVID-19 pandemic and what it means for our people, and how we can sort of coordinate our public health responses to ensure that we have a much more seamless and cohesive um, um, response to this pandemic. I think that's the pressing issue for anyone. We don't know the longevity. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know when it's going to end. So that's really one of the core ticket items that he's going to have to look at as leadership. Um, I think as well as that, regional travel is going to be another big issue. We've seen now the collapse of Leah, and that in of itself, or the collapse in one sense, and the rebirth, according to Prime Minister Brown, in another sense. But the idea of his position has been, well, that's not our issue. Because we have Caribbean Airlines, and kind of we're just gonna leave them sorted out. But as chairman of CARICOM now, regional travel is a concern, if not Liliat saga, but the issue of how do we make regional travel much more affordable, much more accessible to the people
Mm-hmm.
in the region will become an issue at the CARICOM table. And then, of course, there's going to be the international sector, how you interface with the fact that in November we may have a new president of the United States, which would mean new relations with the United States, and what does that mean for us in the region? Under Obama, the CARICOM, you could say, enjoyed fairly good relations with the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. He was even in Trinidad and Tobago for a
Yeah.
CARICOM U.S. summit or something to that effect. I think they were hosting something, um,
Mm-hmm.
and so Biden, if he is successful, being he was under Obama, we expect him to be very palatable to CARICOM interests. And this may be a very good thing for the region. So he'll have to deal with um, that aspects as well, and certainly many other issues that arises of out of his presidency. What I do agree with you strongly on is that PM Rowley has been a very strong regionalist and adopts a respect for the institutions of CARICOM. I
Mm-hmm.
remember when there was an issue of the U.S. was adopting a divide and rule kind of approach, and they were the
Mm-hmm.
foreign secretary, the Secretary of State was meeting with CARICOM. He just
Mm-hmm.
issued a very strong denunciation of
Mm-hmm.
the division between the prime ministers. He
Leaders.
says there's one person appointed to speak on behalf of the prime ministerial heads of government, and that is Mia Motley, and that
Mm-hmm.
there is a chairman of CARICOM, and that there is a CARICOM secretary general. And so for you to be individually meeting with members and inviting them to meetings, and this is
Yeah.
dividing our region, and this kind I
Mm-hmm.
remember him issuing a very strong enunciation of that, and a very clear indication that he stands in solidarity with the region. And again, it goes back to, I think, the philosophy of your party, not the
Mm-hmm.
party, the PNM. The PNM was the one of the strong, the forefathers, you say, the founding fathers, you can say, of
Mm-hmm.
regional integration. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that is the 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 Eric Williams administration was, signed the Treaty of Chaguaramas. He was one
Mm-hmm.
of the instrumental figures behind the predecessor. Even though he did leave it saying 10, one from
One
10
from
is
10.
legal, but
Mm-hmm.
he was, prior to that, one of the big individuals within the federation and so forth. So the PNM, coming from Williams, going into the successive administrations, have always been very big and very pro CARICOM. I don't want to be unfair to the UNC. I
Mm-hmm.
just don't know that because they have not had that very intimate connection with the formation of CARICOM and its institutions, that there may have been that strong association or that strong emotional sentiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's the reason. But I do think any prime minister will play their part and they will do what is needs to be
Yeah.
done.
Yeah. I
Insofar as
think
region, okay.
before you go to elections, and I think and I agree, every prime minister will do their part, but I know that, and like you said, we have been in a period of even more active and more active, I think more visible, perhaps also because of the pandemic, but more active, a little more visible, and a little more verve, a little more vitality within our regionalism because of that leadership, or that chairmanship of Mia Motley. And I think that, and again, this thing about parties and how they approach elections, and certain political leaders and politicians, certain prime ministers, how they approach CARICOM, I should say. That this period that we are seeing, and I don't know if I wish the chairmanship was longer, or how we could do that and how we could push that. But this Mia Motley to Ralph Gonzalez to Keith Rowley, this sort of unbroken link of pro regionalism, pro advancement of regional agenda, I think is a momentum that we should not lose, and we cannot afford to lose, and a
Mm-hmm.
momentum that is
Mm-hmm.
good
For the people.
for the region.
Mm-hmm.
I think as well, even to that one from 10 leaves north, I think that also shows again this commitment to regionalism, that if one of us goes,
Precisely.
and it goes back to the same thing about this divide and rule, that if one of us is sort of out of sync or out of step, then the whole thing could fall apart. And then you touched on an excellent point that I hadn't yet considered in terms of the incoming U.S. president. What will happen there? We don't know because we were surprised in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Like I said, with 2020, anything could happen. But that is a good thing to point out, particularly in the context of not just CARICOM relations, but also U.S. Venezuela relations, and then U.S. TT relations.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be interesting to see what happens even at the OAS
Mm-hmm.
level, and then what happens between the US and CARICOM, and if
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
new president, if he were to come in, how it would
Would work.
how it would affect our regionalism. But to elections, as we wrap up, I would give you the last 15 minutes in terms of elections to come.
Right. So I don't know how to use 15 minutes, but I'm just gonna say, we've seen two experiments so far under, well, three really. We've seen Guyana, St. Kitts, and now Trinidad, under the COVID-19 situations, and it's very interesting to my mind to observe elections in the Caribbean under this new dispensation. I think in St. Kitts, it really did help um, the incumbent administration to have this pandemic. It was a very, I wouldn't say want to say convenient, but it was certainly very opportunistic. because what it meant was that you had to close the borders. And I know in
Mm-hmm.
St. Kitts, one of the issues that they have been complaining about, or at least it's been a debate, has been the idea and the influence of non-nationals returning home, not non-nationals, but nationals, sorry, diaspora
Diaspora, people in the
voting
diaspora.
in the elections. And a lot of people believe that the diaspora vote really is what propped up Dr. Douglas, Denzel Douglas, in the previous elections. Now you
Mm-hmm.
had the closing of the border, it was sort of a natural experiment to see if there was any validity to this thesis. And we see a resounding victory for the incumbent administration. They did even better than the last go around. So it was a clear, and I think also there was a sort of a Denzel Douglas fatigue, which goes back to the point of knowing when to walk away, which we in the
Mm-hmm.
Caribbean, I think, do not know. I think if the Labour Party had switched leaders in St. Kitts, they would have fared much better. I mean, then
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Douglas got, I think, 3 or 4 terms. Like he had
Mm-hmm.
served his time. Why are you bringing him back? And so I think people were fed up of Dougie and they wanted to change. Um, so I think that of course, and then the other point about the pandemic being that the campaigns were virtual, mostly virtual, so you could sort of gauge how the public was responding by looking at the views and so forth. And I think that the Think It's Labour Party, Nevis Labour, sorry, the yes, Think It's Nevis Labour Party did a much worse job than the incumbent administration in terms of utilizing social media to its advantage. So I think this has been really interesting to watch. Trinidad we spoke about at length, leaving Ghana for last because it's
A
Trinidad
situation.
we spoke about at length, and the only thing I will say is that now that the dust has settled, that I'm very pleased with the smooth, almost very rapid um, result declaration, and the way that the elections seem to be conducted with fairly minimal issues. Of course, people complain about recounts and so forth, but it seems to be a very smooth process, and that seems to be good. Um, uh, we're still waiting on the numbers to see what the voter turnout looks like. I think the numbers will be lower than usual, both because of
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic and because of the fact that you have this sort of incumbency thing where people just do not want to turn out. So we can expect to see, I think, much lower than last year. Maybe not much, but lower than last year. Um, Guyana. Um,
And let me point out here, as I said in our Facebook post as well, on this issue of observers, Guyana had all the observers that
all the
one could
observers
want,
that yes,
and
exactly,
still,
had a
and
very
still,
calamitous election
we've exactly still we waited how many months from the 2nd of March they had the polls,
until now,
not until August,
August.
not until August. I guess you could call it an emancipation, freedom from that election eventually coming, in August when they finally had a result declared. So observers are important,
Mhm.
but they might not be necessary.
I don't want to get too much into the Guyana situation because that could take us another podcast. What I will say
Yeah.
about the Guyana situation is that it was disappointing to my mind the way that um the people, the institutions of CARICOM were sort of not respected. I think this is my opinion. Um,
Mm,
in the process, I think when you have people telling the chairman of CARICOM that she had no right to speak about the issues
mm,
in Guyana, and that that it was improper for Ralph Gonzalez, one of the senior statesmen in our region, to speak about. It was the first time in recent history that a member of our community, we've seen
mm,
internationally these kinds of unstable elections, but the Caribbean has always prided itself on peaceful transitions of power.
of power.
We
Mm-hmm.
have had stable, one of the hallmarks of development of our region is that there's a stable political system, a stable democratic system. We've long
Yeah.
since passed the days of political violence and electoral this and that. And I was really concerned that Guyana was quickly deteriorating into a situation of political violence and sectarian violence. And I was really, really
Mm,
concerned about that. Thankfully,
yeah.
we saw an end, a peaceful resolution to this problem. But it was really the first time in recent history that our community has been tested in this way, with one of our members seemingly is not behaving or not living up to the principles of democracy to be we
Mm.
uphold dear. And
Yeah.
I think in that response, of course, the CARICOM chairman had something to say.
To say, yeah.
I think, of course, senior statesmen like Raul Gonzalez should be there. I mean, we had to send observers. We had to send people to do recount. Um,
Yeah.
and even the publication of the recount, there was an unwillingness to accept the results of the recount. Um,
Mm.
then the CCJ intervened, and the CCJ issued a declaration saying that, listen, you have to use the results of the recount. This is the highest court for Guyana, and it's also a regional court. And even then, there
Yeah.
was still some pushback. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit down here and defend any one side in this conflict. What I will say is that I think that the incumbent administration did not, to my mind, show the kind of respect for our institutions the way that they should have.
When you say
I
incumbent, you
mean,
mean the incoming or the outgoing? The
the
outgoing.
outgoing,
You have to be, yeah.
Grange administration,
Right.
because I just felt that, you know, I personally would have preferred a much tougher approach, but I suppose given that it was the first time we had to deal with it delicately. But
Yeah.
I feel Guyana, the situation in Guyana was one where the politics of Guyana, much unlike the politics of Trinidad and Tobago, is far more volatile insofar as
Mm.
divisions, sectarian divisions, tribalism, divisions along racial lines, and so forth.
Violence
Um,
and the
the
violence as
violence
well.
as well. So you have a much more unstable kind of multi-ethnic society than in Trinidad and Tobago. I think in terms
I
of
think.
I think in terms of Guyana as well, that there has been a long-standing history of of elections and accusations of elections being rigged, and
Mm.
the political violence and so forth. And so there's this acrimony around election results. In fact,
Mm.
not this year, but the one before that was one of the more peaceful elections that we've had in Guyana.
Yeah.
Before that, you had a lot of controversy, and it's very
Yeah.
sad to see that return. And what I'm
I
hopeful
think.
for, just in the last point,
Mm.
what I'm hopeful for is that coming now that it's dust is kind of settled, we can see some kind of process of reform, electoral
Moving
reform
forward.
in Guyana that can bring about a more transparent and a more stable political outcome.
Yeah. As we have 4 more minutes to go, and I just wanted to say on that point, I think as well, some of the the lack of respect, if you want to call it that, for those CARICOM institutions may have been by those within. I mean, we saw it on social media, the comments that turned into a nationalistic sort of one country against the other. When
Mm-hmm.
no, this is the role of a chairman, and this is how we do it.
Precisely.
And even to the approach that they took, which was a very sort of pacifying approach. I think it was also necessary, and other as opposed to a heavy-handed approach, because one, we're not in the business of burning bridges, but
Mm-hmm.
two, within our
Mm-hmm.
region, and we know from, and I mean, now is not the time, but even in the 1990 coup, we know that even though we have dust ups, and even though there might be this propensity to um to want to overthrow a government, or to want to steal and quote, and I don't know, allegedly steal an election.
Mm-hmm.
We know that, with enough consultation, with enough talking, with enough, cooler heads will prevail, or good sense would prevail.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe it took a little longer than they anticipated in terms of coming, arresting this impasse to 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 reach the resolution, or some kind of resolution. But I think the approach was fine. I will give you 1 minute, because we really have 2 minutes left. So 1 minute in terms of looking forward: St. Vincent and the Grenadines,
Yeah,
Belize,
very quickly.
Jamaica, bullet
So
point,
bullet point. So
bullet.
Ralph Gonzalez is up for an unprecedented fifth term. We'll see if he's able to do it. He's a very charismatic leader, and I believe he might pull it off, honestly.
Mm,
And in terms of Belize, the constitutional term limits there that prevent the prime minister from running again.
mm,
So that there's really a change in leadership there. We'll see how it goes. I'm not familiar too much, but we'll see what happens. And possibly Jamaica might be called early.
Mm-hmm.
I'm expecting Andrew Holness to be returned in
To
Jamaica.
return.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Mm.
But of course, we will, and we could meet again on the soapbox to talk about those elections when they do happen. And again, to go into more detail on that, guys. I know it's been a long episode. I know you've sat, if you've got to this point in our recording, then you've sat through the entire thing. I hope that the discussion was informative as well as thought provoking, for you. Share with us as always in the comments your views, your perspectives. Again, you can find us SoundCloud, iTunes, Apple Podcasts. Although if you're listening to this, then you're already on one of those platforms. Anyway, we are now also on YouTube, Facebook. We're doing this whole thing where we're trying the videos, all sorts of things. It's a new year, new things, unexpected things. But I guess from our conversation, we've come to the realization that the result of this election was somewhat expected. So maybe the only thing that was expected in 2020. I want to thank you, Carlin, for
No
joining
problem.
us
It's been my
today,
pleasure.
for giving your insights on this topic. And to all of you who went out and vote, I know I've been saying, and I could probably stop saying now, I was saying the most effective way that we can get on our soapbox in this period is to go out and vote. Trinidad and Tobago, you went out to vote. I thank you, especially for all of you who went out to vote, especially when there are others, those who are too young, those who are otherwise incapable, those who are outside of the borders who could not vote. And I mean, only the voter turnout will tell us, or will tell me if you're really, if you're really turned out in your numbers. But thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, we'll continue the rest of our season doing some political analysis, doing what we typically do, getting on our soapbox for things that we are passionate about. Youth political participation is one of them. But in general, guys, get on your soapbox.
Thank you.